the British especially dominantly supplying soldiers and weapons. When they have to use the soldiers provided by the British, they have to pay. And they could not pay in cash. They were shipped from South India to work in the plantation with the low wages in that kind of racial hierarchy type of manner that you think, okay, South Indian is lesser than the Chinese, or Chinese is better than the Malays.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today, especially to discuss what I think is a very important book produced by one of our colleagues here at UIII. I think that I can, there are two things I want to basically highlight here. The first is that I think Dr. Nia's book comes in the tradition of important works like K.S. Chowdhury's Asia Before Europe. Asia Before Europe, the World of the Indian Ocean from the Rise of Islam to 1750, which I think is a landmark text. And in so many ways, it also can be read in conjunction with Curtis's work, The Indianized States of Southeast Asia, Munoz' work that looks at the pre-Islamic connections between South Asia and Southeast Asia. And I think what's doubly important here is that Nia's work builds upon the research that has been done and expands the frontiers further by looking at the dynamics of politics from the colonial to the post-colonial present. I think what this book shows, and we're having this discussion in the context of today, where we talk about globalization, South-South, initiatives, contact between the South. I think what you see here, and I think this is a hugely important point for us, is that the history of the Klings, is basically a history of a southern globalization. It is a globalization that was initiated by people of the South even before the term South emerged, because we know the term South is a loaded term, because you can't have a South without the North, and South and North, these are terms that actually talk about power differentials and economic differentials. And this harks back to a period when Asia was able to develop its own globalization on its own terms. And I think what I find fascinating about this book is the way in which you look at the vocabularies, the names, not only place names, but also the names attached to social functions and roles in society, which points to an entire socio-economic, socio-cultural life world that actually existed and then was superseded and erased by colonialism. So in that respect, this is a book not only about the people of the South, not only about the connections between South Asia and Southeast Asia, but it's basically a study of globalization. And if you want to do a study of globalization, this is one way of doing it. One doesn't just study the movement of capital, one studies the movements of people through settlement and exchange and cross-fertilization. And here you see how this contact is actually multi-layered. Now, since you talk about language, let's look at the words, right? You mentioned the Coromandel Coast. Coromandel from a derivative of the word Cholamandalam. Cholamandalam, the land of the Cholas. So what we have here in the history of the people of the Coromandel and of the Kalinga coast are people from South Asia who maintained communication, contact, movement, and settlement and migration over a period of time from the Hindu-Buddhist period to the arrival of Islam. The end of the Cholas, 13th century, coincides with the rise of Islam in Southeast Asia. And what we see here, and this is another important point, is the coming of a different belief system did not lead to conflict, right? So what do we get out of this? Us as not only historians, but people who study politics and geopolitics. Here you have nations that have to deal with alterity and difference without falling into the oppositional dialectics of immediate opposition. Like you said, the early settlement doesn't come with they're going to steal our jobs narrative. How different is that from what we are seeing in the world today? And I think for us in the South, and again, we are a Southern university, we're in a Southern country, UIII is committed to uplifting the voice of the South. I think it's very important that a book like this emerges from the South. for us to reclaim the histories and geographies and vocabularies of the South. So in that sense, congratulations. By the way, she didn't pay me to say nice things. I mean, this is all sincere, right? Although you owe me dinner after Ramadan. Okay. Now, no, so I think, so how do we read a book like this? And I think here is where historians like us, have always been making this point. History is never just a collection of names and dates. History provides you good history, proper history, and this is good history, yeah? Proper history because it's based on not only data, but it analyzes processes. And that's what history is. It's actually a record of processes, allows us to understand processes and mechanisms. And I think a book like this is important, not only for those of us who study South Asia or Southeast Asia, but also for those of us who study, processes, globalization as a process. You want a history of globalization? This is a history of globalization. This is a history of globalization in the South, by the South, for the South. Yeah. Before they emerged this idea that, this notion of a South against North or East against West dichotomy. So it's a nice, segue from Chowdhury, Munoz, Kodes, all the way to Delina. So your name's going to be part of the tradition now. So get used to it, right? The other thing that I find interesting, and this is where I put on my other hat, which is that of a philosopher of language, yeah? Because what's driving this book is a question: how did this identity become problematized and stigmatized? Yeah, and I think here is where I think we need to also command the tools of linguistics and basic linguistics and how language works. And what Nia shows in this book is how a general term, kling, which begins not only as neutral, but actually benign and positive, right, becomes in time a negative term. Now, this is true of all things. All words, can experience change over time. So, like, if you look at the history of the West's engagement with Asia, Asia begins as a positive thing. It's a land of plenty, it's a land of wonder, it's a land of wealth and riches. But over time, with the advances of colonial capitalism, Asia as a concept becomes denigrated. Then Asia is backward, savage, primitive. The same with Africa. Africa begins as an idea that is positive. It's alluring, it's something that draws Europeans to come into contact and engagement with it. But after the subjugation of Africa, then the term Africa, the same word, is given a negative connotation. Then Africa is chaos, anarchy, backwardness, and what have you. Now, this is true of all words, but words don't just become negative, they can become positive as well. Wealth, which in the past was a negative thing, is now very positive, right? So everyone wants to be a millionaire. So this is why, as historians, we don't just study processes. The processes are meant to actually illustrate how our lived reality changes over time. And of course, the situation that you have now, I agree, in some parts of Southeast Asia, the term kling may have negative connotations, not for all, but for some. But that can also change. So I think it's important that we as historians play a role in this, that we remind people that your reality today is not natural. Yeah, if you live in this world now, in the age of late post-industrial capitalism, when hyper-consumerism and the all the anxieties that we face about our future, that's not a natural process. Processes lead us to where we are now. If you understand the process, then you understand how we got here. If you understand how we got here, that also gives you ways to perhaps address the question and attempt solutions. So I see this work as, like I said, an important work of history. It's also an important study of globalization. And if you look at it through the lens of, say, discourse analysis, then it's also an important contribution to our understanding of how words change meaning over time. And if words change meaning over time, then the language you use to describe our reality also changes over time, because our reality is discursively constructed, right? So in that sense, if you put it up on the sort of academic achievement KPI, right, it sort of ticks all the boxes, So the dean is here, so perhaps I can So just a bonus for a work. And I think it's important that this book comes from us, from UIII. Yeah. I want to end with that. I think UIII has an important role. We regard ourselves not only as an Islamic university, but as a kind of diplomatic effort. UIII is trying to be different. It's trying to be a university that internationalizes not only Indonesian scholarship, but scholarship from the South. It's hugely important. I keep telling this to all the students, right? I mean, we write for ourselves. We have to write our own histories, our own theories, our own explanations to understand how and why we are now. That doesn't mean blindly rejecting everything else, but it means trying to grapple with hard issues like this in a very honest and academic way. And I think this is the kind of scholarship that UIII has to keep producing over time. That's the only way that will make an impact in the world. So thank you for inviting me to speak about your book. Thank you for the free copy as well. But above all, thank you for, I think, making an important contribution to our field, history.